All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Word with Ty Brownlow. I am your host, Ty Brownlow. Remember, no one is worthless, no story is worthless. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are having history lessons taught to us, okay? And you know I pride myself on informational content. It gets no better than the guest I have today. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Dr. Charles L. Chavis. How are you?
Listen, I'm blessed, Doc. I'm blessed. I'm honored to be here. So proud of what you're doing, Mr. Brownlow. So proud of you. And thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on the platform.
Oh, no problem at all. You know, seriously, the pleasure is all mine. I am very thankful for you and what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into that, let me just run down who you are and what it is that you do, okay? So, for those out there wondering, well, Ty, who is Dr. Charles L. Chavis? Okay, this is who he is. He is the Assistant Professor of Conflict Resolution and History, also the Founding Director of the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race. For History, Justice, and Race at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. So the man knows what he's talking about, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, all right, so let's just get that clear. But let me take you a little bit deeper, okay? What are some of his expertise? What does he specialize in, you say? Well, here it is. Specializes in civil rights oral history, historical consciousness, and racial violence and reconciliation. That is a mouthful, but bottom line, the man knows his history, and we're here today to get this history. But I could also add one more thing to that. Author. Okay? He is the author of the book, The Silent Shore, The Lynching of Matthew Williams, and the Politics of Racism in the Free State. So, yes, you have a lot of credentials. Man, we are here to talk about it. And I see the beautiful book behind you there. So my first question to you is, tell us about this book.
Wow. Well, it started actually, the journey to writing this book started when I was a doctoral student at at Morgan State University, HBCU, Morgan State. And I was a doctoral student. I was actually reading a book by Professor Sherilyn Ifill, who is a civil rights attorney who has really been doing amazing things for the NAACP. And she talked about some lynchings that took place in Maryland. And, here I am, a doctoral student at Morgan at HBCU in Baltimore, and I'm coming from North Carolina. I thought that lynching and racial violence was really like something that happened in the South. But what I was able to find out is that, with Professor Ifill's work, is that these lynchings took place throughout the country and even in Maryland, and specifically on Maryland's Eastern Shore. And she highlighted a story of a black community in a black business district and region that was targeted by racial violence during the 1930s. And it was at that point I decided to find out more about this black community, but also about the victims of racial violence. And really, I sought out to salvage their humanity and tell their story, which is very important. Because what I noticed as a historian, growing up and just also being educated, is that there's so much emphasis on numbers and politics and all this, and there's a lack of focus on who we are as black people, what we love to do, what we envisioned, everything that we enjoyed, like what were our hobbies, who do we like to hang out with, what was our pastimes. These are things that are left out of our larger narratives. All you hear about, even when we think about today in the modern sense, when we look at anti-black violence and racial violence, when we hear about the victims of this, we know nothing about their humanity. All we know is about some of the alleged acts or alleged deeds that they had done. For example, with George Floyd, we hear about a fake $20 bill, right? All of his humanity is tied up in an act that has not even been proven in a court of law oftentimes. And what's unfortunate is that oftentimes, historically, the victims of anti-black violence never have a day in court to tell their story. And I wanted to be able to tell the story of Matthew Williams, of his family, his community, and himself, and his humanity.
Look, now you just spoke volumes right there when you're talking about the humanity of these victims that have been, unfortunately no longer with us, due to these heinous crimes. As you talk about George Floyd, I think about Mike Brown, I think about so many others. I'm here in Chicago. Even I think about Laquan McDonald, who was, who was shot over 20 times by police, and it's just, you really speak volumes when you talk to that. Now, it's very interesting you're talking about the 1930s, because I know also during this time we're talking about the Great Depression, we're talking about the stock market, crash or what have you. Now, North also, staying in that same vein, you also have the Harlem Renaissance actually getting started in New York as well. So you have all these different factors going on, in the North, and people are thinking, well, hey, if I go north, everything will be okay, everything will be all right. But as you said, history doesn't really tell us about these, lynchings and these murders against black, people that were happening in the North. And I know as well, even in New York, before it was Central Park, I want to say it was Seneca Park or something of that nature, like that land belonged to black people. Manhattan Beach on the West Coast in California, right outside of LA, belonged to black people, and they were chased off their land just like the people in New York as well. So these stories aren't talked about as much. And as you said, sometimes we get caught up in, okay, all of the racial violence is in the South, Mississippi, Alabama, maybe Tennessee, Texas, Florida, or what have you. But there were things actually happening, on the Eastern Seaboard. So now the story takes place in Maryland?
Yeah, in Salisbury, Maryland. So what's interesting about Salisbury, Maryland, it's really, we call Maryland the middle ground. It's a really strange state in terms of the politics, and they didn't necessarily, it wasn't a slave state, but they did side with the Confederacy in some parts, right? And so it was like a border state, a very strange state with a large population of free African Americans, which made for a very volatile type of culture, right? Imagine being coming in Baltimore, and you look at some of the major abolitionists who we know about, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. The reason why they're so successful and able to really navigate out of enslavement within Maryland is because of the large free black population that they're able to blend in with as they move northward, or as they go through Baltimore, the city, etc. There's free blacks who have a semblance of freedom that they don't have necessarily in other states. And so this made for a very volatile cultural relations between blacks and whites, specifically poor whites who, found themselves post enslavement. They found themselves competing with people who used to work for free. Right. And how does one do that? The job market opens up. You have those who are enslaved, who were originally working for free. Now they're on the job market, and there's a volatile situation that's created politically and culturally, and racial terror emerges out of that. And so the main point of my book focuses on economic strife and the correlation between economic strife and turmoil with racial violence. And what we see in the Great Depression is really, it speaks to the resilience of the black experience, the black community, right? And I think it's very strange to specifically white populations who are navigating through these financial issues and crises. And I think for me, what I noticed, what was so difficult about Matthew Williams during this time, why he was such a threat, is the same reason why Tulsa was such a threat, right? While having black wealth in the midst of so-called turmoil, and being able to survive and thrive in the midst of so-called turmoil is very problematic to those who don't look like us in many ways, right? And so what we saw in Salisbury during the Great Depression, we saw a black business district that Matthew Williams was a part of, a black community that was finding a way to survive, make a way out of nowhere, if you will, during one of the worst economic crises in our nation's history. And that really upset a lot of poor white laborers who would find themselves in bread lines as the Great Depression emerged. And Matthew Williams and the entire community that he was from was targeted. And the lynching was the message crime that was used to begin the dismantling of this black business district and this community. And that's something that we're beginning to unravel as we work towards taking the book to an actual documentary film series, which I'd love to share with your audience. It's actually hidden in full view, and it's actually a very short treatment that we've developed that highlights the story. We're interviewing actually descendants of the terror that actually took place. We have a 95-year-old Miss Audrey Matthews who talks about the terror that on that night, and then also talks about what happened afterwards, right? Because a lot of times we think about the actual act of racial terror that happens on that day, but what we need to understand and why this work is so important is that these things continued up until this day, and they've evolved. And I'll let you see if you have any more questions for me before I keep going, because I want to make sure.
Okay, well,
concise.
Well, no, man, please, brother, please lay this knowledge on us, and trust me, my questions will come, but I am very, very, very involved in what you're saying.
Yeah, I think for me, what we have to really understand is that white supremacy thrives off the suppression of narratives, right? And so what that means is, if we're able to silence these stories, if we're able to silence black people and silence all of the stories that we in our communities we know are true, but the community at large or the world at large has not validated it, right? What this book does, the descendant of Matthew Williams, she talks about this book as being the revealed truth, right? So everything in this book, and why this book was so important to me, was because I wanted to lay it all out there, right? We talk about lynchings happening historically, and then the thing that we always say is that they happened at the hands of persons unknown. Nobody knew what happened, when in reality, everyone knew what happened. They happened on the courthouse lawn. They were advertised in the newspapers prior to them actually happening. And America wants everyone to believe, black communities to believe, all of America to believe that, these things happened in secret, in private, when in reality, they happened on the courthouse lawn. They happened with law enforcement right there beside them, and some law enforcement were involved. And that's what my book reveals. It names the names of all those involved in this, including the state's attorney, including the chief of police, the sheriff, all those who are sworn in to protect and serve are involved in lynching Matthew Williams. It goes all the way to the governor of the state of Maryland, Albert C. Ritchie.
Okay, now, very key, because I was going to talk to you, I was going to ask you a little bit about his importance and that of Detective Patsy Johnson, I know, who are key characters in this story as well. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Albert Ritchie is governor. He was governor for a very long time in Maryland, the longest serving governor in history of Maryland. And he came from political royalty. He was a Democrat, and he emerged at a time in the Democratic Party when the Democratic Party recognized at least progressive Democrats such as Ritchie in a state, as I mentioned, very strange state in Maryland, where you have this strong black progressive, I call it this black prophetic power that emerges in Baltimore and has been there historically, with Thurgood Marshall and all of these other leaders are there. And the Democratic Party recognized early on that they would have to find some way to engage with this black elite group of political and social leaders in order to jockey for any type of presidency, in terms of the presidency. And this is where Ritchie became someone who was able to distance the Democratic Party, because we have to remember the Democratic Party was originally part of the Klan and all of that, right? That's the thing people don't realize. And so here's Ritchie saying, listen, I want to be the person who's going to be able to get the Democrats out of this whole backwards, racist, clannish type of ideology. I want to show them that we're civilized and that we just don't that our main focus is on the lack of federal control. We want to have states' rights. We want the states to control what's going on in their purview, right? That's what he's saying. However, what we reckon, and he wanted to do that with lynching. So we have all of these laws historically. People talk about where's the legislation on lynching. Well, there's been legislation since the turn of the 20th century for lynching. But again, that's federal. And so Ritchie was like, look, we want states to handle their own issues. And as executive in Maryland, I'm going to be the one that can handle lynching. I don't need an anti-lynching bill. I don't need any of this. I'm going to handle this on my own. And lynching is no longer going to embarrass states such as ours, but also the Democratic Party, right? So he was trying to distance himself from people like Theodore Bilbo in Mississippi, who was basically, I mean, straight up, look, he was for lynching. Like, it was just like blatant. He was trying to say, look, we can't talk like that anymore. Y'all are backwards. We can't deal with that. We have to do something different if we're going to get the presidency, right? And so he makes a gamble. And what I say he does, he tries to court the black vote, and he actually does so in one of the major areas in the book, The Transitional Period, is when he's campaigning actually in Chicago, and amongst a group of black supporters. And he's trying to use this lynching to secure the black vote, the national black vote, right? So he's saying, we don't need an anti-lynching bill. What we need is strong executive authority. We need someone like me who's going to handle this lynching, investigate it, and hold the people accountable. We don't need a bill. I can handle this. And so he says, I'm going to hire, right, I'm going to, first of all, out in the public, I'm going to say, listen, I'm going to have an investigation. This whole idea of this strong executive leader, I'm investigating. He's calling the people out, saying it's a disgrace, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all what I call lip service, right? He's trying to use this to set so that black people can think maybe we can support this man, maybe he is for us. And what he ends up doing, he has an investigation. He has his state's attorney, his attorney general. He has him actually, investigate the lynching. He sends them from Baltimore to the Eastern Shore, and they're investigating, they're interviewing, and they're doing all this stuff. However, he recognizes, and as most people recognize early on in the investigation, that the whole town is corrupt. The whole town is involved. The states, even the government leaders, are involved. The mayor is connected. You have the state's attorney for the county who is literally working with the mob, right? The sheriff is all complete. They're all involved. So is the chief of police. And once he recognizes this, he's like, okay, this can't get out, because again, remember, it's his whole idea. He's trying to use the lynching, right, to say I'm strong, I can handle this. But what's happening is this is going to get out. It's going to show how weak he is as a leader, right. And he going up against this backwards white racist community on the Eastern Shore. He has really met his match, right? Because not only do they have the political power, but they also have the financial power as well. And that's something that I uncover in my work, and why it's so difficult. Because really what's happening is that the individuals behind the lynching, the actual muscle, as I call them, they're mostly poor white laborers who were paid off by the business leaders to carry out the acts in lynching. And so they're insulated and protected financially and otherwise. And once Richie recognizes this, he then begins to hire a Pinkerton detective agent, Patsy Johnson, who he then brings in from the Pinkerton Detective Agency to infiltrate the mob. And I would say within the first month, I actually discovered the journals of Patsy Johnson during my research. They were actually hidden off-site on the Maryland State Archive. And that's a whole nother story about why it's so important for black communities to salvage and make sure that we are taking care of our records and our materials, right, and our history. Because once they get into white archival institutions, we have to recognize that these institutions aren't designed, right, to salvage or respect the narratives of those that are oppressed, right? So if that's the case, then our papers, our records, slave manumission papers, all these records I know now in many cases are deteriorating in some of these institutions. We can no longer allow that to happen. I think for me, that was a major wake-up call when I discovered these records. They were literally hidden for 90 years. The witness statements of all of the victims, both black and white, as well as the journal of Patsy Johnson, who literally infiltrated this mob over 3 months. And I have the daily journal, what he did every day. And the men who confessed to doing everything is all there. And the biggest gift for me in the end was being able to give this to the descendants of Matthew Williams, And for them to be able to see this revealed truth, as they say, that I was able to put out, it's, and people always, a lot of people have been saying, this book is about lynching. How can you talk about something so traumatic? But for me, what I think is so important, this book is not so much necessarily about lynching, right? It's about the path towards and racial healing, and it's about, but truth has to come before that. We can't get to racial healing and all this stuff before we tell the truth, right? You see what I'm saying? So I think that's one of the most important takeaways of the book is it's important, the truth telling. And this is one of 4,000 or more stories, right?
Wow.
So yeah.
Look, let me just say, like, my mind is blown. I'm not as shocked, by the actual, deeds. It's really the other, part of it, the hiding, the putting the records away, basically intimidation of those, who are all like involved, who are all witnesses of this, and basically getting their stories and hiding their stories away along with all of the information that goes with it. Now, look, we talk about the abolishment of slavery, 1864, I believe slavery was abolished, and here we are, we still have these lynchings going on all over the country now, not just in the South. I know the South, as you said before, they're brazen with it. They're like, hey, this is what's going to happen. Even you don't have to step out of line just for the simple fact that, if you have something, constructive going on over there, we don't have anything constructive going on over here. We're just going to take what you have and make it our own. And I'm sorry, people, America, this is the story of America, okay? And that's just what it is. But now let me ask, I know you alluded to it a little bit, but can you just talk about it a little bit more? But as I said, when we talk about lynchings and the abolishment of slavery, I know we were talking, before this, but, there's at least 40 or more lynchings that still happen in the state of Maryland, after this, including, the lynching of Matthew Williams. So why isn't Maryland seen in the same eye as a Mississippi or Alabama or even a Florida?
It's a numbers game. Like I said, we don't focus on the humanity, we focus on numbers. And so what then happens is if you don't have a high roll, then nobody really focuses on your story. And that's something that I seek to dismantle in my approach and even in my research as a historian. Everyone's written books about the Deep South, lynching in the Deep South, because really that's where the focus is, right? And even with enslavement, when we talk about the history of enslavement and the history of the Middle Passage, there was a battle that went on in terms of scholarship around the Middle Passage. And there were two scholars who argued about what were the numbers? Was it this million or this million? How many? And I'm like, okay, we know it was in the millions. Whatever number it was, the humanity is lost in all of this debate. And so for me, I wanted to show people that yes, lynching took place in Mississippi at a much higher rate, but at the end of the day, this was someone's loved one who was murdered. And the humanity is what we have to be able to salvage and rescue in this current era. I think it's so important for us to recognize as we think about the connection between racial terror lynchings of old to the modern day lynchings like of Ahmaud Arbery that we see today. It's this whole idea within the system, within the government and within our system of justice that makes it okay for black bodies and the black life to be devalued, right? It's like, I think about Michael Brown, about how his body sat in the street for how long, right? It's this lack of humanity for black and brown bodies that is consistent, because some people always tell me, why lynching? Like, this is not happening anymore. Why you talk about this? And I don't get caught in that game, right? Because that's the game that you get caught in. And that's the whole point I talk about in the book, why we have to be careful. It's not so much about lynching as much as it is about anti-black systemic violence, right? The goal at the end of the day is to suppress and silence and also to control black bodies and black power, control black political, social, economic power. Lynching has always been a message crime to put black communities, black people on notice for stepping outside of the lines that were established in communities throughout this country by, and the foundation was laid, as you mentioned, through slavery, right? And so during slavery, you didn't need Jim Crow segregation per se, because when you woke up every morning in chains, the hierarchy was there in front of your face, right? And so after slavery, there had to be something that replaced this system. Jim Crow emerged, racial violence emerged, lynchings emerged as message crimes to be able to put black people on notice, black communities on notice, that sought to realize the American dream. And so that's something that's very important, but that's consistent throughout. There's a direct line we can draw between Matthew Williams, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and all. There's a direct line, and we have to acknowledge that as a country.
Look, let me just say also, I think certain histories get lost during that time as well, because when we talk about, sometimes when we talk about the building of this nation, not just blacks alone, but I could definitely remember a time when there was, racism against, Asians, like the Chinese, in the building of the railroads. You want to talk about the Trail of Tears with the Native Americans, like America is, for the lack of a better word, founded on these types of events, and I just want to ask this question, in your opinion, and this is a question of mine. How can, stories like, Matthew Williams and, others, be a teaching tool when we talk about Juneteenth and critical race theory that, obviously a lot of schools want to, not deal with, and even books like the 1619 Project that get a lot of flack. But how can stories like this be a teaching tool when we talk about those things?
Well, I think we have to be able to value the idea of what healing really looks like, right? And how truth is central to that, right? And what I like to do, and borrowing from Brian Stevenson, he talks about how we have to be able to value the concept. So this concept of truth and racial healing, or truth and reparations, or truth and repair, whatever we want to call it. And for the most part, what we see in this country, we have a large majority of people who call themselves Christians, right? And me as a Christian, I value this concept of restoration, right? And second chances, right? But it comes with repentance and truth. You have to deal with that truth. And for a lot of people who are not wanting, who talk about healing and why we have to talk about this, is really, when we don't talk about and ignore it, is contrary to basic principles that a lot of whites and others really should be valuing as a part of their Christian faith, right? And I think that for me is one of the major issues that I have in this current phase of the freedom struggle that we're in which we're so fearful of the raw truth, right? We're so fearful that what black people have known about and what we have suffered and the trauma that we have went through is going to be acknowledged. Right. And that's really what it's all about. The acknowledgement. That's the first step. It's not the end. It's the acknowledgement. We want people to take this book, to take the stories that we're telling, to take the cases of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and recognize and acknowledge these cases and say that black people, when you see a Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery, you don't just see those specific cases. You see a legacy of trauma that is within your DNA that we as police officers, state's attorneys, and others have failed to acknowledge. We may not have done anything back in the day when those things happened, but today we can say that we're better than this, and we're going to fix the wrongs and the issues within the criminal justice system to make sure that these outcomes don't continue. Because that's the thing that's undeniable, right? With systemic racism, you can say that, systemic racism doesn't exist, critical race theory is a joke, but it's about outcomes. Systemic racism is about outcomes. And when you look at the number of incarceration numbers that jump, as I tell my students, it's either because black people are as backwards and as broken as they say we are, or it is because it is all based on a lie, which we know it's all based on the lie of white supremacy. As you mentioned, our nation was founded on racism, sexism, right? And anti-blackness. And so if our nation is founded on that, then every institution, every system within that nation is flawed. And if we don't change the systems, I think education is a big one. And this is one of the reasons why I think education is under attack, right, in our country. I'm in Virginia, and we just recently had a Republican governor who won, and his first executive order was to get rid of critical race theory and the more contentious, as they say, history, right? So again, promoting lying, right? Because that's really what it is. Either our story as Black people, or in our story and the story of Native Americans or Asian Americans is America's story, or it's not. And I think for me, as someone who is a historian, before I was a historian, I was a history teacher. I taught high school history. And so I don't want to say I got in trouble, but I basically was like, look, this textbook is good. But again, this is where we talk about how Audre Lorde talks about the master's tools, right? How they'll never dismantle the system. And so we have to recognize as educators the ways in which that our books are designed, curriculum is designed, and we have to take some creative license, right, to be able to teach content that is just as American as whatever said publisher says is American, right? And that's, for me, that's so important. And I think it's something that we can all do. And so even with looking at Matthew Williams and looking at this story, it's very important for us to recognize and value the truth. I don't like getting into the fake debate around critical race theory, because there really is no debate. Teachers do not have time to teach critical race theory in a classroom. They don't have time to teach it. We barely can get in some sections on enslavement. We barely can get in the slave narrative. And you are the boogeyman, the invisible boogeyman of critical race theory they're trying to put out. It goes to show you what type of political carrots can be thrown out to make, for the most part, whites fearful, right, of just truth telling. Because that's what it's about. You don't want your child to know that all of these companies, all of these banks, all of their money, all of these universities, their endowments were all built on enslavement, right? You think about JP Morgan and Chase, all these insurance companies, they're all, the reason why they exist to this day is because of their investments in the slave trade. And if that is the truth, then there is a reckoning that is right behind it. And that's what people don't want to talk about. And that's why the conversation around reparations is so toxic. But it shouldn't be, because, I think, and one of the things about my book, what I also wanted to dispel is this myth around these conspiracy theories, right? That's something that, Black people in the Black community, we've always had to deal with. Like, I know people would always say, I know people in my family who suffered racial terror, who dealt with all of this, and people are like, sure, it's like, and we've never been believed as a people. And what this book does, it lays it all out with the evidence that was hidden from us, right? And so all of the stories, when I talk to the descendants, and when I talk to people who I share my book with, who one of the ladies is Miss Shani Shields. She's a civil rights activist who actually marched in the 60s and was actually one of the characters in my book, Dr. A.D. Brown. He actually birthed her. He was a Black physician, the only Black physician. He was one of the main witnesses in the book, whose story I was able to capture. I found his actual eyewitness statements. And Dr. A.D. Brown actually birthed her, Miss Shaney, and he passed as white. And the reason why people couldn't figure out why he was able to get close to the mob and see what was happening, because he passed. And because of his account, we know exactly who was involved in the lynching, but we'll never have known. He told the state's attorney everything, but they hid these records away. They told no one. So that's what makes it so traumatic. And to this day, the community, right? And we talk about Tulsa. You mentioned Tulsa, and you mentioned these other communities. The lynching of Matthew Williams is not just about the individual, but it's about his community. And I lie to you not, to this day, in 1931, when Matthew Williams was lynched, there were 19 Black businesses, homes, and it was a Black business district that was there in this community. To this day, there's only one building that remains of that community, and that is the Charles Chipman Cultural Center, or formerly the John Wesley United Methodist Church, built by former slaves, in which Matthew Williams attended. That's the only building. Even the black bodies in the cemetery have been exhumed. And to this day, the black community of Salisbury is still suffering the ramifications of this injustice. And that's the next phase of my work.
Wow. Well, look, let me just say, I am glad you're on, this case. I am glad that you're on, the right side of history. And, I think about most of my ancestors are from the South and the heart of the Delta in Mississippi. And I think about certain towns like Mount Bayou and Rolling Fork, Mississippi, and things of, little small towns, not the Jacksons or Clevelands or all these other, cities, but the little small towns, and how they were affected by such things as well. Especially in the town of Mount Bayou, Mississippi, which isn't far from where my mom grew up, in a small town called Panthersburg, Mississippi. And Mount Bayou, sort of like, Salisbury, is it? Yep. It's sort of like Salisbury, Virginia as well. And basically some of the same things happen. And as you said, when these things happen, it leaves the heart and the culture and the soul of the town just desolate. And that continues over time.
Exactly.
And basically these stories get swept under the rug, or they're never talked about again, or there's so much trauma, that you don't even want to fathom, okay, I don't even want to go back to think about, these things. That's why I'm grateful for people like yourself, people like Dr. Joy DeGray with the post-traumatic slave disorder, the 1619 Project, things, because these are essential. These are essential tools. And I feel as if in this day and age, we get so caught up, as you said, in numbers, that we don't really think about the humanity of those who came before us and what they had to endure, and how that's really tied into what we're doing today as individuals. You bring up the Ahmaud Arbery's, George Floyd's, the Michael Browns, and that's just to name a few. This is still going on today. No, not physical lynching, but in border reform. They want to make it harder for us to, actually express ourselves and really vote. Prison reform. That's a big one, what can we do about this crime bill? What can we do about prison reform? Reparations. We are due, if you're going to bail out these big companies, and to quote Wu-Tang, and it's always a good time to quote Wu-Tang, Method Man, behind every fortune, there's a crime.
Come on.
Okay? So, I'm just saying, I ain't say it, Meth said it. So, look, y'all go look it up. But no, look. You are important. You are imperative. I love what you're doing. And just as a side note, talk to us about you and history, and why is history important to you?
Well, yeah, I've wanted to be a historian since I was in the 3rd grade, believe it or not. And I have a very unique background. I remember when in the very infantile stages of the internet, I remember Googling Howard University and their African American history program. I ended up going to Morgan down the street in Baltimore to get my PhD, but I've always wanted to know more about my heritage and my people, right? And I think this is birthed out of my experiences, believing I grew up in a predominantly white community, right? And so I really didn't get exposed to a lot of my own history through school, and so I had to go do it on my own. So I found myself doing extra projects during school, during Black History Month. Y'all didn't celebrate or do anything, I can handle it. I would do my own projects in the community and celebrate our success, even in some of the local success in our community that just was not acknowledged, right? And I think for me, that's really what the way I approach history is to really highlight those who have been marginalized and overlooked, specifically at the local level. And so I could have wrote a book about this, a national movement, a national political struggle, etc. But I really wanted to honor the local struggle and the local history, because for so often, Tulsa is one of the major issues that historical episodes that we have to confront and deal with. However, in the midst of that, we have to recognize that there's more than one Tulsa. This has happened in other areas and other communities, not directly through as much as direct racial violence, but the systemic violence is just as bad, right? And so that's something that I think is so important, that we have to think this through and recognize that it's always not going to be the blatant racist acts that we're going to we see and that we have to deal with. We have to target those systemic acts as well. They're just as violent, right? The decisions that are made in courtrooms, in corporate offices, right, that are impacting black bodies and all of us are just as equally as important as those direct acts of violence that we think only affect one individual or community. So I think for me, history is a tool that we can use to really build our own future, build a better future, but we have to use it and confront that truth, as I mentioned. If we don't confront it and acknowledge it, then there's no hope for us in terms of moving forward as a country in terms of racial healing or justice.
Mm-hmm. Come on. Woo! Look, I told y'all we're going to school today. Look here, we having Saturday school, Sunday school, whatever you want. Man, we got it here. Informational content. I pride myself on that. This is definitely one of those times, folks. This is stuff that you won't normally hear on regular television or even cable sometimes. So, man, please, who's ever listening to this, if you got to watch this 4 or 5 times to really get the understanding, do so, And on that note, let me get back to this book now. You're not done. This isn't the only thing, as you mentioned before. You're going to talk about, other things that came along, besides this book as well. Will there be like a docu-series or something of that nature?
Yeah, so we've already released a film series called Hidden in Full View series. And you can visit my website, charleschavis.org, to be able to get all the information you need on the film. And it's a film that highlights the beginning of a short documentary that lays out piece by piece this story, specifically bringing this history to the community. And so we've already been in touch with and worked with some of the descendants of the lynching and also some of the community stakeholders. But we're going to be also interviewing some of the descendants of perpetrators who actually were behind the lynching. Right, because again, it's important for us to recognize that communities, cities such as Salisbury, lynchings took place in this city, yes, right? We know that. But communities are more than this one act, and we've got to, but we can't ignore them because people are still hurt. And if we're going to be whole, then we have to lay the truth out there. And so we're going to be doing interviews with some of the descendants of perpetrators and other eyewitnesses, and we're going to be filming them, and hopefully they'll soon be on PBS soon. And so I have to come back and talk with your audience about that a little bit as it comes out, if you'll have me back.
Look. Say less. Let me just say something now. You coming on to my platform, dropping these jewels, okay? Jewels, ladies and gentlemen, like historical jewels. You are considered family, okay? So if I consider you family.
Cookout.
Yes, cookout, man. Look here, cookout, ice, whatever you got. All right, man. Bring it on over, okay? Look, you are always welcome to come back on this platform, sir. All right, always, anytime. But
Thank you, sir.
Where can we get the book?
Wherever books are sold. And so right now you can go to my website, charleschavis.org, and you'll see the link right there. Buy books. You can get it on Amazon, Bookshop, Barnes & Noble. Supporting black bookstores is very big for me. And so definitely you'll see the link to the blackbookstores.com to make sure to support there as well. But anywhere you got an Amazon gift card you want to use, go ahead and use it. But if not, like I said, independent bookstores or anywhere books are sold.
Yes, look here, them black bookstores, support. I'm thinking about one right now out in California, Malik Books. Hey, shout out to Malik Books and everything you got going on. Also here in Chicago, the Afro Zone and everything else. Man, look, shout out to y'all. Shout out to like keeping, our stories told. Man, shout out to y'all for keeping people such as Dr. Charles L. Chavis in the loop, man, for us to see, what's going on. And look, I just thank you for coming onto my platform and seriously, once again, blessing me and blessing us, with everything that the book and the knowledge as well. Now, if people want to follow you on social media, do you have a social media site?
Yes, at Chavis 4 change, everything. Facebook, Insta, Twitter. At Chavis, Chavis, 4 change.
All right, look here. Right on, brother. Right on. Look, now, my last question, I'm going to remix it. I normally ask, what is the one word that best describes you and why? But we're going to flip it. So, Dr. Charles L. Chavis, what is the one word that best describes your teachings and why?
Wow. I would say resilient. Yeah.
Oh.
So, my teaching is just like, the way I approach research. I don't leave anything out for chance. I want to lay out the entire story. And if it takes me a little time to lay that story out, then I'm going to take that time, because the human story and the individual story and everything about our communities and our people, we deserve to take that time because it's not taken elsewhere. And so I would say definitely resilient. As a teacher, I run up against a lot of pushback and sometimes around just doing this type of work, right? Because most of the work we do in terms of, because I focus on peace and conflict resolution, and so a lot of the work is international. But I believe that if America is really to help and assist and aid internationally, then we have to be able to deal with how we treat those who are of color and minorities here in America. We can't talk about why all these issues internationally that we're dealing with and how we can help if we're not helping those or treating those in our country who are oppressed well, right? So that's what I would say, resilient.
Well, look, I got two words: universal treasure. Okay, all right, those are my two words for you, because I just really think in this day and time, we've had scholars, but sometimes those scholars get caught up in the mix and they're sort of washed to the wayside. But to have someone as yourself coming from the humanity side of things, telling stories from the humane side and how this affects us, internally, not just us, those around us, and even like generations after that. Hey, if I can find, people like yourself, man, I'm going to cherish them. Okay, so universal treasure. That is my word or words for Dr. Charles L. Chavis. Look, once again, I've said it a million times. I'm going to say it again. I thank you for coming onto my platform. I thank you for talking to us. I thank you for schooling us. And he will be back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just letting y'all know. This ain't the last. This is not the last you all have heard from Dr. Chavis. I can tell you that. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Word with Ty Brownlow. I've been your host, Ty Brownlow. Remember, no one is worthless. The story is worthless. Follow me, all social media platforms, at Word with Ty Brownlow. Or you can go to my website, tybrownlow.com. Y'all getting this gospel, okay? Because this is gospel now. You know what I'm saying? It's teachings, but it's gospel. Okay. Man, but you getting this, plus other great interviews. Dr. Chavis, I thank you again for blessing us. We out, y'all. Peace.